Hey, this is all about core skills, comms. Now, basically, what you need to do is demonstrate that you can read something and work out what it says and put it into your own words and work out whether it's any good. In other words, work out why it was written and whether the author, whether the person that wrote it has managed to do what they were trying to do and give evidence for your view that they did or they didn't. So if you read a piece of work on, for example, whether Tesla can really make complex parts from stamping aluminium, one of the big things that Tesla does is it's really simplified the production process and it's reduced the cost of making each individual car by spending an absolute fortune on aluminium stamps. So a large part of the car is made through using 500-ton aluminium stamps on presses, rather, on thick pieces of aluminium. So what you have to do is you stamp the metal and bend it through complex shapes in order to avoid lots of expensive fabrication and working and welding. Now, of course, when you do that, you can put certain stresses into the metal, and there comes a point where it's very hard to turn a piece of metal through a corner and give a good finish. So if you're reading a piece of work on the limitations of aluminium stamping as a method for making cars, and it contains in it something about, for example, the difference between structurally important bits of the car and other parts. So, for example, there are things that you can do to aluminium that really strengthen it. The people that found out how to strengthen aluminium, metallurgists who worked on it, they didn't really understand what was happening at the level of the sort of, I don't know if it's crystals, but at the fundamental level of the aluminium, they didn't really understand what was happening. But what they did know was that by heating things and cooling them and aging them and weathering them, they very often changed their properties. So they were taking aluminium, which is a very light and cheaply available substance, and they tried heating it, sparging it, in other words, heat it up until it's really hot, then stick it into oil, stick it into cold water, do lots of things with it. And one engineer, I think, or metallurgist, had to go on holiday for a couple of weeks. So he left a whole load of aluminium to sit for 2 weeks before coming back. And I think that was how they created, is it duraluminum, I think it's called. But there's a particular kind of aluminium you can get, which is they use it to make things like bicycle frames. If you look at a lot of mountain bike frames, it's tungsten inert gas welded aluminium. So my bike, for example, has got a lot of scrappy aluminium welding up in where the tubes meet, and that's a tungsten inert gas welded aluminium frame. In other words, they managed to weld it inside a little sealed container with tungsten inert gas to make a weld, because apparently if there's oxygen present, it doesn't weld properly. Now, if you're reading an article and it's got stuff in there about aluminium and what you can and can't do with it when you're making a Tesla car by way of stamping out shapes using a 500-ton press, you need to be able to understand what the article says in terms of the ideas. So you can't just repeat the words. What you need to do is go through the process of reading the article, working out what the ideas are, presenting the ideas to yourself as little short headings, and then writing the thing back up in your own words. So, for example, a minute ago I said that it's possible to take aluminium and to heat it and to cool it and to age it and to put it in and out of water and oil, and eventually you'll produce a new material that's got different properties. It's more brittle, but it's much stronger, and it doesn't bend. It's much more like steel. Now, if you're reading a paragraph in an article about that, you need to make a wee note to yourself that says something like, heat it, cool it, muck it about, stronger. And when you write down heat it, cool it, muck it about, stronger, when you then go to write in your own words, you don't look at the original article, you look at the note and you say, all right, okay, so you would think aluminium is a given thing. You would think aluminium is a given thing. So an aluminium bicycle frame is just made from aluminium. But in actual fact, it's possible to do things to aluminium when you treat it, such as, for example, cooling it very rapidly after heating it up. And this can change the qualities of the aluminium and make it into almost a different product, right? So you write that and it shows that you've really understood what you've read. So you need to do a bit of reading for comms. and prove that you can understand what's been written, express it in your own words, and say whether it's any good or not, say what's right and wrong with it, and give evidence for what's right and wrong with it. So that's the basic idea. Now, this isn't a particularly outrageously high level. Nobody's going to ask you to read something really complicated. So it's going to be a reasonable level. So you need to read something. You need to pass that reading element. Then you need to pass a writing element. So you need to write a piece of sustained writing where you explain something to me, explain something that you've read. You'll write something about 500 words long on something that you're interested in, and then that will form the basis for you to stand up and do a wee PowerPoint if we're back in the college at that point. Failing that, we can do it online. I'll find a way to do it online. We could probably do it through Zoom, or you might do a PowerPoint and just I'll show you how to do audio over the PowerPoint, a bit like this one. So we'll do a bit of speaking as well. So you have to read something that I'll give you and work out what it says, work out whether it's any good. If it is good, tell me why it's good. If it's bad, tell me why it's bad. Tell me what you thought the author was trying to do in the piece of writing. And we'll do some practice for this. We'll do about at least 3 or 4 marked practices. So I'll give you 3 or 4 things to read, and you can do a wee practice before we do the one that we'll keep as the assessment. And I'll make some suggestions about topics that you can write on, engineering topics, and you can pick one and do a bit of reading and then write 500 words on it. Once you've done that, it's very easy to do the presentation, because all you need to do then is take the main ideas from the bit of writing that you've done. So say for the sake of talking, you did a bit of writing on high-speed rail, okay? The government's going to spend a fortune, £100 billion, on this high-speed rail network. Now, the big problem with high-speed rail is it has to be arrow straight. It can't really bend too much. So they're going to take down a whole load of houses and spend a fortune making this really expensive rail. Now, the thing is, for every small reduction in speed, it dramatically reduces the cost. It's much, much cheaper to make a high-speed rail system that's even 10, 20 mile an hour slower, because a little bit slower means a lot less energy and a lot less danger, and you can have bigger corners that go round things, and you can afford to have more stops as well. Because one of the big problems with high-speed rail is that England is a very, very geographically dense country. There's lots of cities, there's lots of towns. So the problem with high-speed rail is that you're going to end up with a situation where the train gets up to 160 mile an hour or whatever, and if you want to stop it, it's going to take 12 miles to stop and another 10 miles to accelerate again. So if you do a wee piece of writing on high-speed rail and the engineering problems of high-speed rail, once you've done that, it's really easy to take the main ideas out of that and stick them in a PowerPoint. And then all you do is you stand up and talk to your PowerPoint, and that'll be the 3 comms things done. So just to recap, what need you do? What do you have to do? You have to read, you have to write, you have to speak, you have to listen as well. I should have added that earlier on. One of the things you'll do when you do your speaking is answer a couple of questions from me or from somebody else. And that involves working out what it is that I'm saying. So if you tell me that high-speed rail is going to produce a lot of economic benefits from the north, for the north of England, like Manchester and Yorkshire and so on, and I say, do you think it will bring in benefits for places that are between the two, between London and Manchester? You need to understand what I'm asking, and then say something relevant back. Like, for example, I don't know, or it might, or it'll depend where the train stops. So you need to read, write, speak and listen. You've lots of experience doing this already. You've read, tens of thousands of things already. You've spent huge amounts of time arguing with people about things that you disagree over. You've spent a massive amount of time watching other people make arguments, like me, for example, right now, or listening to me. So you've seen teachers do this for 13 years. So you've got a huge amount of relevant experience already. It's not that difficult. If you do a bit of work and put the hours in, comms is not a difficult thing to pass. So specifically on the subject of reading, pick apart a piece of writing, okay? Now that involves really understanding what the words mean and what the sentences mean. One of the biggest problems when it comes to reading is that people don't understand that there's lots and lots of ways to express the same idea. So for example, I'm looking to my right now and I've got an optical mouse. Okay, now if I say something like, one of the disadvantages of a traditional mouse with a roller inside it is that it tended to be quite contaminated by debris because it was soft rubber in order to grip properly when it came to mouse mats and tables. But because it was soft rubber, the crisps and biscuit crumbs and other things that typically ended up on the surface of a table got picked up with the soft rubber. Now I'll say the same thing again. You wouldn't willingly lick the rubber ball inside a mouse because every single piece of discarded food from inside the mouth of the slack-jawed loon like me, who sits at a computer and munches his lunch when he should go to the staff room and therefore sprays small amounts of debris over every available surface, will be on that mouse and will probably kill you. So I've basically said the same thing twice. The first time I just gave a kind of neutral description of what the mouse would be like and why it would be contaminated. And the second time I said something supposedly trying to be a bit funnier about me sitting at my desk eating my lunch. The same thing. So when you're reading something, you need to understand it in terms of ideas, because once you've absorbed the idea, like for example, the idea that the rubber ball inside a mouse gets filthy, and therefore the big advantage of optical mice, the big advantage of optical mice is that they don't get filthy. Once you've absorbed that as an idea, it's quite easy to explain it, and you can explain it in writing when you come to write. And you can explain what the person has said when you're doing the reading. And when you're talking, you can glance at a PowerPoint, and if your PowerPoint said something like optical mouses healthier, you could then look at the audience and you could say, because one of the big things about optical mouse is that you're not actually then anything like as much picking up whatever it is that's on the surface that you're using to move the mouse. And you're explaining something that you understand. If somebody asks you a question, you can answer it. So you pick apart a piece of writing when you're doing your reading. You evaluate it. Now, to evaluate is a slightly different thing from to analyse, because evaluation says whether it's good or bad. The clue is in the title, value. So when you analyse something, what you're doing is you're taking apart the thing. If you analyse somebody's argument, you take it apart and you show the parts of it. And when you analyse, you're taking it apart, and probably they would agree to that. They would look at you having taken their argument apart, and they would say, yeah, that pretty much is my argument. That's what I'm saying. And then you say, okay, now let me tell you why that's not a good argument. Let me tell you why the bits don't fit together the way that you think they do. So evaluation is typically what you do after you've analysed. You analyse something to work out what it amounts to, and then you evaluate it by saying whether it's a good or bad example of the thing it's supposed to be. So when you look at Celtic playing in Europe, I see they lost last night 2-1. If you look at Celtic playing in Europe, you'll say, right, okay, so we basically had 65% of the possession, but 60% of that possession was in our half. So that's analysis. Anybody can agree with that because that's what the software, the computer software shows. The evaluation then is something different. You say, so basically they were letting us have the ball because they thought we couldn't do anything with it, because they knew that on the occasions they did get the ball, they'd be able to do something with it. So they were quite happy to let us play around and not actually spend much time trying to close us down, because they felt as soon as we came into their half, they would be able to strip us of possession and hit us in the break. That's evaluation. That's a different kind of thing. So evaluation, as I say, is predicated. In other words, it's based on having some analytical ability. And as I say, you work out how the piece of writing fits together, and then you say, it's not a very good piece of writing, because it was supposed to be written for example, a piece on HS2, a piece of writing on high-speed rail, HS2, might be written for environmentalists. So you're trying to convince environmentalists that the piece of writing is, they try to convince environmentalists that the project, rather, is environmentally friendly. It's going to cost a lot to build it, but once it's up and running, then it won't have too much of a environmental impact, because the amount of energy involved in running the trains will be very low, and it will save energy, it will save carbon rather than flights or cars. Now, if for the sake of argument, you look at a piece of writing And in there, it's got lots and lots of attacks on the motives of environmentalists. So there's lots of abuse in there about Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. You could say, well, it's not a great idea attacking the people you're trying to persuade, because a lot of the people that are reading this might be quite in favour of Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. So it's probably not a wise idea to attack folk if you're trying to persuade others. So that kind of thing. Is this good or bad? So you have to write on the thing you've read under certain headings. Now, as I've said, that involves basically to break it down into the most fundamental things. You need to tell us, who it's aimed at. Who was this written for? Who's the audience for this? And then tell us the main ideas. And then tell us whether you think it's a successful piece of writing and why it's a successful piece of writing. So it helps if you go through the process. It helps if you hit all the bases. If I can tick a box where I can say, well, look, there you go. That's where she says this is who it's written for. That's where she lays out the main ideas. There's where she says it's good or bad, and those are the reasons why it's good or bad. So it helps if you can hit the bases. The piece of writing. So pick an appropriate format. Now, for most of you, given this is engineering, appropriate format is going to be a wee report on something. Minutes are a record of a meeting. That's generally a more difficult thing to do. Particularly, it's going to be difficult when we've got a COVID lockdown. So I wouldn't recommend that. You could write a wee essay, 500 words. It might be easier to break it down into a report. So you could say, the case for high-speed rail. Or keep using that example. Take something like, for example, the wind turbine on the Cathkin Braes up above Castlemilk. So there's a turbine up there. So you could write a wee report on that. What was the argument before it was put up? How much energy does it generate? And has the project been a success? Well, those are three nice headings, So do a wee bit of research and work out what the turbine, or take a better example, maybe not a better example, but another example. There's a massive move towards these flaming electric bikes. So if you look, you can get really, really high quality racing bikes that have got a battery, a big lithium battery and a motor hidden in the bottom bracket. So sometimes when I'm out on my bike, killing myself, some guy might be out as well. And these days you can't really tell whether he's got a battery in his bike. It used to be the case you could leather somebody up a hill and you'd be dying at the end of it, but you'd be thinking at least I won. And these days, sometimes when I'm 55, that doesn't happen. I get beaten. But you're left with that wee idea in your head, did he really beat me? Or is there a great big round lithium battery in the bottom bracket? Legally, the lithium battery shouldn't kick in above 15 mile an hour. So these guys kick your ass going up a hill, because if the hill is so steep that 15 mile an hour is a really fast speed, then they can turn on the power. Sometimes the motor will produce maybe 500 watts of power, which is huge. 500 watts of power is more than even Bradley Wiggins or Chris Froome can generate for any length of time. Top cyclists can do about 420 watts. They can sit at that for about 40 minutes or an hour. Even now I can sit at 306 watts, which I'm quite proud of. So I can do 306. The motor can do 500 sometimes up a hill. If you can set it. It's not supposed to drive you faster than 15 miles an hour, but you can set it so that it goes like hell up a hill. So if you're writing a report on these battery-powered bikes, for example, the government recently changed the law to try and encourage people to use battery-powered bikes and scooters and similar things to try and get around the COVID transport problems and encourage a more environmental approach to transport. So if you write a report on these bikes, Van Moof is one of the big companies. They make a £2,500 bike. I've seen a couple of them recently. So if you write a report on these bikes, in terms of what the actual situation right now is in terms of the sales and how common they are, the engineering challenges that the making such bikes face, and then the future in terms of acceptability for the public and for the lawmakers and so on for other road users. Again, that's a nice wee report, breaks down into 2 or 3 parts. So pick an appropriate format, and that might well be a report. An appropriate layout, stick in a few pictures, use a reasonable vocabulary, proofread. Very important to read your own work. Read it out loud. Actually just read it out loud and hear your own voice and say, does that sentence make sense? Have I put in the commas and the full stops where they need to be? Does that sound sensible? Would someone who was hearing this for the first time know what I meant? So write appropriately, use paragraphs, use a reasonable word choice. Paragraphs are important. The way to think about a paragraph is that a paragraph either makes one big point or it groups together a number of separate points which are all kind of related. One of the things you have to find out when you're writing is, if you're writing, what you do is you read a number of things which are going to be roughly relevant. So for example, you get a number of things on electric bikes and you write down wee notes on the points that the authors make in their paragraphs. Then you look at your notes and you try and work out how to group headings in your notes. So if you read one article on, for example, the specific company Van Moof, and exactly what's true of their bikes in terms of the engineering and how the bikes are marketed in different markets and how it's different in the UK compared to America. So you make a few wee notes like that and you say, top end, high end, Van Moof, they can do 30 mile an hour in America because it's a different governor. So you write down Van Moof, expensive, America, fast. You then read a different article and it says all about racing bikes in the UK, and the Ribble company are making a racing bike with a motor in it, and Sean Yates, I think his name is, Sean Yates, the cyclist, has got a heart problem. So he now uses this bike as part of his, for recreation, because he's got this heart problem now that he's in his late 50s or early 60s, right? So you write down Van Moof, expensive, America, Britain, different, laws. And then you write down Ribble cycles, Sean Yates, heart problem. So you've got 6 very different points there, right? And you think to yourself, okay, what am I going to do here? Am I going to try and find a way to link these two things, or am I going to find a way to separate them out? Now, the most obvious thing here to note is that the Van Moof bikes and the Ribble bike are both really expensive top-end bikes, although made for slightly different purposes. So I would link those two together and I would say, okay, I'm going to write a wee paragraph on expensive top-end electric bikes. And then I'm going to write a different paragraph on Britain and America, how the law is very different. And then I'm going to write a paragraph on the disabled or the partly disabled, including former athletes and the use that they can make of these bikes, in this case, Sean Yates. Now that makes a number of nice points and it links two things together that were found in 2 different bits of reading. And that's how you learn how to write. Writing is about finding out how to impose your own structure on somebody else's work. Somebody once said, if you take something from one place, that's stealing. If you take it from 2 places, that's research. So you read a few things and you take notes, and then you look at your own notes and you allow the ideas to percolate in your head. You read the notes repeatedly until they start to form links and you start to see connections between things, and then you impose your own structure on the notes and you write. So you want a logical, structured layout, which the classic thing they tell you when you're speaking or writing is tell them what you're going to tell them it, and then tell them what you've told them. Yeah. So say what you're about to say. In this presentation, I'm going to tell you about the new revolution in transport that electric bikes represent, the particular engineering problems involved, and how they are a very different thing in different countries because of the law. Okay, fair enough, you're going to tell me those 3 things. You then tell me each of those 3 things, and then in conclusion you say, so therefore in conclusion we can see that America is a much more permissive environment in most states, but in the United Kingdom we've got really serious regulatory problems. What is clear is that the bikes will become cheaper over time and are becoming cheaper already, so they probably represent the future of transport. And there you go. So you tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them it, and then you tell them what you've told them. Same thing is true when you're writing. Your introduction lays out the issue and probably what your argument is going to be, and then you tell them, what you've told them, and you find a slightly different way to tell them what you've told them in the conclusion. One of the classic pieces of advice is, if you lay out at the start what your position is, people think you're the real master of the material. Because when somebody writes an essay or gives a talk and it isn't clear at the start where they're going, it makes it sound as if they don't really know themselves where they're going. As soon as you tell somebody that heavy industry is dead in Scotland and it will never be reborn except perhaps in the manufacture of wind turbines, oof, that's a confident start. Many people are upset with the decline in heavy industry in Scotland. We once made ships, we once made trains and cars, and now all of that is gone. I have to tell you that heavy industry will not return to Scotland in most sectors. However, it may be the case that wind turbines do represent an opportunity to reinvent Scotland's heavy industry. As soon as you say something as confident as that, people think you've really mastered the material, and that holds whether you're writing or speaking. So emphasise the main point, as I said, make it clear that you know what you're talking about. Write about 500 words, which sounds like a lot, but it isn't. Winston Churchill once said that I can give you a long speech right now if you want, but if you want a short one, it'll take me a bit of time. And what he meant by that was it's really easy to do a long speech. You know what I mean? It's like you can ramble on quite easily. The trouble starts when you try and trim it and make it sharp. So a piece of writing, 500 words sounds like a lot. If your writing is normal, you're going to write about at least 300 words in one side of A4. So a couple of pages of A4 is going to be more than 500 words. So it's not that difficult. Speaking and listening. Speak clearly, loudly, appropriately, be understood. Now, the biggest thing in this comms unit, and this will be a problem if we're back in the classroom, it might be less of a problem if we're doing this online. The biggest thing is folk that won't understand what it is to lodge an idea and not read, right? You need to lodge an idea. If you wanted to, for example, do an engineering report on air rifles, and the power of air rifles and whether they could be usable for pest control, right? You can actually make an air rifle incredibly powerful. Compressed air can generate a huge amount of force. There's an air rifle that generates 500 feet-pounds of force, but it does it using a really big slug, a really big heavy lead bullet. Because the thing about air pressure is you can generate a lot of total energy, but it's hard to generate real velocity from the bullet unless you certainly run into real engineering problems because the pressure starts to get huge. So essentially you could use air pressure to have a mortar or a gun, like a field gun in an artillery piece. You know what I mean? You can use compressed air to throw a car. You know what I mean? When you see a car flipping over in the movies, what they actually do is they use compressed air and a wooden ram inside the car, and the wooden bit of trunk of a tree gets slammed into the ground, and that flips the car over. So you can lift the whole car quite easily with air pressure, because you're lifting something not that quickly. You're moving a lot of mass, a lot of weight, but you're not accelerating it to 1,000 meters a second. So air rifles that are powerful can generate. You can make an air rifle that generates 500 feet-pounds of energy, which is more than a 9mm handgun that the American police carry. But it generates the energy with a dirty, great big huge slug, big lead slug that's almost like a stone, and it throws it fairly fast, but not that fast. So there are problems involved in pest control, because what you really want is a nice small bullet going very fast that puts a hole right through the animal and kills it instantly, but doesn't involve a massive amount of energy that might go flying on and cause other problems. So there are problems, engineering problems involved in air rifles. And as I say, if you're standing up and you're talking about this issue, that it's quite hard to generate velocity in an air rifle, but it's easy to generate total energy. So the air rifle that you buy across the counter in a sports shop in the UK, in Scotland, only generates 12 feet-pounds of energy. Now 12 feet-pounds of energy is nothing, but it generates that energy by firing a little tiny pellet at about 900 feet a second. So that little tiny piece of lead will go right into a rabbit and kill it instantly. You can generate a lot more energy with a catapult, but if you fire a big ball bearing at a rabbit and hit it, it might be squealing, it might not die instantly, it might get badly injured, you might break a load of bones, because you've got a lot more energy, but the big piece of ball bearing, big piece of steel is not going to go through the rabbit, so it won't cause the same kind of shock. It'll break bones and it'll injure the creature. So there are engineering problems involved in using high-powered air rifles for pest control. You could shoot a fox and it might injure the animal, you don't want that. Now, I understand the issue. I understand why the total energy produced by compressed air can be very high, but there's trouble generating velocity because you have to create very, very, very high pressure to generate that kind of speed, that kind of velocity. Now, if I stand up and talk about that and I understand it, I'll be talking the way I'm talking right now. I'll understand the issue. What students tend to do is they'll put up a PowerPoint and it will say, an air rifle cannot generate very high velocity because the pressures involved in generating the velocity are too high for most cylinders, and therefore total energy is not a good guide to the usefulness of the rifle. And it will be written out like that in longhand, and they'll turn and they'll read it from the PowerPoint. You can't do that. You have to lodge it as an idea in your head and then stand up and talk to the idea. So that's quite important, because if you don't learn to do that, it'll really limit your education. That ability to turn words into ideas is what allows you to become clever, because it means when someone's standing up and talking to you, you're turning the things they say into ideas. You're working out whether the ideas fit together. If you want to work out whether someone's talking nonsense, you have to turn their words into ideas and then see whether the ideas make sense. So it's a vital skill. So there needs to be some structure. Now, as I've said, if you do your presentation from the piece of writing, there will be a structure, because you'll have taken it from the piece of writing. So that should deal, if you do the piece of writing correctly, then the PowerPoint will follow. Proper emphasis. You hear the way I talk. I try to put emphasis in the right places in the sentence in order to allow the listener to find out what's important, what's unimportant. One of the things they tell lecturers is when you're dealing with a class of first-year students in a university, you have to build in quite a lot of redundancy, and you have to repeat yourself in different words, because that allows them to get a hold of it and to have the same thing said differently a number of times, so they're left in no doubt as to what it is they have to make a note of. And then, of course, as the years move on and they get better at it, you can cover more ground in the same amount of time. So emphasising the things that are important, revisiting something and saying the same thing in slightly different words is a useful skill. Use your correct body language. Students will stand and they don't know what to do with their hands. The easiest thing to do with your hands is to forget they're a problem. People put them behind their backs, they put them in their pockets, they hold them in front of them. If you look at people standing in a group in a college at a break talking, they don't have a problem with what to do with their hands. You know what I mean? It only becomes a problem when you stand in front of a class and then start getting nervous. So you have to use correct body language. Move your eyes around the room. Don't walk back. People move too much when they stand and talk. That's another thing that's very off-putting. When somebody starts pacing back and forward, one of the things that happens at teacher training is that they start writing down voice mannerisms. So if you say the word okay or right, quite often people get into a verbal rut. So if you're talking to a class and you say, okay, so what I'm going to do, okay, is to, and you start saying it, one of the people in the teacher training team will put down a little mark on a piece of paper every time you say the word okay, and then at the end of it, when they're doing their feedback, they'll say, you realise you said the word okay 46 times. It's very annoying for the person listening. So become aware of your body language and what you do. Respond aptly to questions, which means one of the most important things is, right, there are no silly questions, there are only silly answers. So there's no such thing as a silly question. And one of the worst things you can do, and I'll be brutally frank, sometimes I'm guilty of this. One of the worst things you can do is allow a smile to come across your face, or to say something slightly dismissive if somebody asks a question which shows they haven't understood. And that's a major problem. You shouldn't do that. I've got a tendency towards it, so I have to fight against it. So you respond appropriately to questions. If somebody asks a question about something and you clarify it for them, you say, yeah, that's a good question. So this is really what I'm trying to say. So respond appropriately. Don't be sarcastic. So do the presentation and don't put it off. Every single time I do this unit, every single time I do any of these comms classes, the person that doesn't want to do the presentation is the person who will probably do it fine, and they avoid doing it week after week after week because they're nervous about it and they don't want to do it. One of the things you learn about presentations is that the person who's nervous about it is the one that does the better presentation. I spoke to a Thai boxer once and I said, how do you cope with fear? And he said, describe fear. And I said, well, yeah, you feel lightheaded, you feel spaced out, you feel really weak, you feel slightly sick. And he says, that's adrenaline. He says, that's useful. He says, that allows you to hit people 10 times harder than normal. And it means if they hit you, it'll just bounce off, He said, see, if you don't feel like that, you'll get killed, you'll get beaten up. So don't worry about that. He says that's all healthy. One of the things that people don't understand about feeling nervous about doing a presentation is that, see, if you don't feel nervous, if you want to experience a class from hell, if you want to have the nightmare afternoon from hell, all you need to do is walk out of the staff room after your lunch feeling relaxed and happy. Because then what happens is you walk in completely flat-footed, and you've got nothing in the tank. You've got nothing. You stand there. I've done it myself, and you feel your armpits suddenly start to pour liters of water down the sides of your body, and you have a bad experience. And sometimes actually the fear kicks in and that saves you. But you don't worry about being nervous. Everyone's nervous, and it's a useful thing.